The shadows beneath it started with a crack. Leah had lived in the old family farmhouse her whole life. It was the kind of place that creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, a symphony of old wood and shifting foundations. But that night, the crack was different. It wasn't the sound of weathered beams or settling floors. It was sharp, deliberate, like bones snapping under pressure. She froze in her bed, her breath caught in her throat. Outside her window, the moon hung low, its pale light casting eerie shadows across her room. The sound came again, louder this time, from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Her heart raced. It's just the pipes, she told herself. Or maybe an animal got into the crawl space. Still, a chill crept up her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, Leah went to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and her grandfather's old crowbar, she pried open the hatch to the crawl space. Dust and mildew hit her in a wave, the air damp and suffocating. The flashlight beam wavered as she climbed down, illuminating cobwebs and forgotten debris. That's when she saw it. In the far corner of the crawl space, the dirt had been disturbed, forming a small, unnatural mound. Something glinted faintly under the beam of her flashlight. She moved closer, her hands trembling. Buried just beneath the surface was a broken mirror, its edges jagged and blackened. Leah's reflection stared back at her from the shattered glass, distorted and wrong. Her eyes seemed darker, her mouth slightly ajar. As she reached out to touch it, a faint whisper echoed around her. "Leah!" She jerked back, dropping the flashlight. The beam swung wildly, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. She scrambled to pick it up, her heart pounding. When the light settled again, the mound was gone. Terrified, she fled the crawl space, slamming the hatch shut behind her. But that night, the whispers returned. They started softly, just a murmur in the corner of her room. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, more insistent. Leah tried to ignore them, burying her head under the covers, but the voices wouldn't stop. "Leah, come back." By the third night, the whispers were accompanied by scratching, long, deliberate strokes against the wooden floor beneath her bed. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to go back. This time, Leah brought a shovel. The air in the crawl space was colder than before, heavy with the stench of decay. The mound had returned, larger now, and the whispers grew louder as she approached. She started digging, her hands trembling as the shovel bit into the earth. It didn't take long to uncover what lay beneath. Bones, human bones, tangled and broken, their surfaces blackened as if by fire. Among them was something even more horrifying, a second mirror, intact and gleaming, its surface smooth and inviting. Leah felt compelled to touch it, her hand moving as if guided by some unseen force. As her fingers brushed the glass, the world around her shifted. The crawl space melted away, replaced by endless darkness. She was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the void, pale, twisted shapes with hollow eyes and mouths that stretched impossibly wide. They surrounded her, their whispers now a deafening roar. "You shouldn't have come back," one of them rasped, its voice a cold breath against her ear. Leah tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her reflection in the mirror, her face twisted into the same horrifying grin as the figures around her. The next morning, the farmhouse was quiet. The hatch to the crawl space was open, but there was no sign of Leah. All that remained was the mirror, now lying at the foot of her bed. Its surface was pristine, reflecting the room perfectly, except for the faint outline of a girl's face, trapped just beneath the glass. And at night, when the house grew silent, the whispers began again. Days turned into weeks, and the farmhouse sat in eerie silence. Neighbors began to notice Leah's absence, but those who dared to approach the property quickly turned back. They spoke of a feeling, a suffocating heaviness that seemed to press down on anyone who got too close. The air itself felt wrong, thick with the weight of something unseen. Eventually, the local sheriff, a gruff man named Tom, decided to investigate. He had known Leah's family for years and didn't believe in the superstitions that whispered through the small town. Armed with a flashlight and a revolver, he entered the house. Inside, the air was stale, the once cozy farmhouse now shrouded in shadows. Tom called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. No response. As he moved deeper into the house, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves. But as he reached Leah's bedroom, the sound grew louder. When he opened the door, his flashlight beam landed on the mirror. It stood upright, leaning against the wall, its surface gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. For a moment, Tom saw his own reflection, distorted and wavering, as though he were looking through water. Then, behind him, another figure appeared in the glass. A pale, hollow-eyed girl with a twisted grin. "Leah," he whispered, turning around. No one was there. When he looked back at the mirror, the girl was gone, replaced by his own reflection. But something was wrong. His reflection didn't move in sync with him. It tilted its head, staring at him with cold, empty eyes. "Leave," the reflection hissed. The flashlight flickered, and the room grew darker. Shadows poured from the corners, stretching across the floor like living tendrils. The whispers became screams, incoherent and piercing, and the mirror began to pulse with an unnatural light. Tom stumbled back, his hand reaching for the revolver. He fired a shot at the mirror, the sound deafening in the confined space. The glass shattered, fragments flying in all directions, but the screaming didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, more enraged. The shadows surged toward him, wrapping around his legs and pulling him to the floor. He struggled, clawing at the wooden boards, but the darkness was relentless. The last thing he saw was the shattered mirror reforming itself, the fragments snapping back together like pieces of a puzzle. When the sheriff didn't return, the town knew something was wrong. The farmhouse was declared cursed, and no one dared set foot on the property again. Years later, the house fell into disrepair, its windows shattered, its walls overtaken by ivy. But the mirror remained, untouched and pristine, sitting in the corner of Leah's old bedroom. Those who walked by the farmhouse at night swore they could see faces in the windows, hollow-eyed figures with twisted grins. And if you listened closely, just beyond the sound of the wind, you could hear the whispers, "Come closer, come back." No one ever did. Decades passed, and the farmhouse gained a grim reputation. Tales of missing persons and the cursed mirror became local legend. Adventurers, thrill-seekers, and paranormal investigators occasionally tried their luck, drawn by morbid curiosity. None were ever seen again. Then came Kate. Kate wasn't like the others. A journalist by trade, she was skeptical of ghost stories and urban legends, believing most to be the product of overactive imaginations or small-town gossip. But when she heard about the farmhouse and its string of disappearances, she saw an opportunity, a story that could make her career. She arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the sun casting long shadows over the decrepit house. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and as she approached the front door, a chill ran down her spine. She hesitated, but her resolve pushed her forward. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the faint beams of sunlight filtering through cracked windows. Kate called out, her voice swallowed by the silence. She began her investigation, her camera clicking as she documented the decaying structure. The house was eerily empty, as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. Furniture sat where it had been left, coated in a thick layer of dust, but there was no sign of life or death. When she entered Leah's old bedroom, Kate felt the air grow colder. The mirror stood against the wall, its surface pristine despite the grime that covered everything else. It seemed to hum faintly, drawing her gaze. Kate approached, her camera held up, snapping photos. The first few shots looked normal, but when she glanced at the screen, her stomach dropped. The mirror's surface in the photos wasn't reflecting her. Instead, it showed shadowy figures, pale, hollow-eyed people with twisted grins, reaching out as if clawing to escape. Her hands shook as she lowered the camera. In the mirror, her reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. Her eyes were too wide, her face pale and distorted. The reflection smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin. "Who's there?" Kate whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection's mouth moved, though Kate hadn't spoken. "We've been waiting for you." The room darkened. shadows creeping across the walls and floor. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. "Kate. Kate. Come closer." She stumbled back, tripping over a broken chair. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and the figures inside began to move. One by one they emerged, twisted, grotesque shapes clawing their way into the room. Kate scrambled to her feet, running for the door, but the shadows blocked her path, solid and suffocating. The last thing she saw was her own reflection stepping out of the mirror, its smile wide and cold. The townsfolk noticed her car sitting outside the farmhouse the next day, but no one dared approach. It wasn't until weeks later that the local authorities ventured in, finding nothing but Kate's camera, lying on the floor in Leah's bedroom. The memory card held dozens of photos, images of the farmhouse, the mirror, and finally, a blurry, distorted shot of Kate's reflection. Her face was twisted into a hollow grin, her eyes black and empty. The farmhouse still stands, silent and foreboding. The mirror remains, waiting for the next curious soul to approach. And at night, when the wind howls through the empty halls, the whispers echo once more. "We've been waiting for you." Years after Kate's disappearance, the farmhouse had become a forbidden place, its legend growing with each retelling. The whispers of those who had entered and never returned were enough to keep most away. But for a group of paranormal enthusiasts, the tales were an invitation they couldn't resist. Led by a seasoned investigator named Marcus, the group of 5 arrived under the cover of night. Armed with cameras, recording equipment, and bravado, they believed they could uncover the truth of the farmhouse and its mysterious mirror. The air was heavy with anticipation as they stepped inside. Marcus, the most skeptical of the group, took the lead, his flashlight sweeping across the crumbling interior. The others followed, their footsteps echoing eerily. The house seemed to breathe around them, the walls groaning softly. Every so often, one of them would swear they heard a voice or saw a shadow move in the corner of their eye. "It's just the wind," Marcus reassured them, though his own voice wavered. When they reached Leah's bedroom, the mirror stood waiting. Its surface gleamed unnaturally in the dim light, as though it were aware of their presence. Marcus approached cautiously, his camera pointed at the glass. "It's just an old mirror," he said, though his reflection seemed wrong. His face appeared paler, his eyes sunken. "Guys, look at this," said Elena, the group's tech expert. She held up a thermal camera, the screen showing a cold, humanoid shape standing behind Marcus. Everyone froze. "There's nothing behind me," Marcus said, glancing over his shoulder. But as he turned back to the mirror, his reflection didn't follow. Instead, it smiled. The reflection raised its hand, pressing it against the glass. A loud crack echoed through the room as the mirror's surface rippled and darkened. Shadows poured from the edges, spreading across the floor like spilled ink. Panic erupted as the group tried to flee, but the door slammed shut on its own, the shadows twisting into shapes, figures with hollow eyes and twisted grins. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping. "Join us. Stay with us. You are ours now." One by one, the group was pulled into the shadows, their screams swallowed by the darkness. Marcus was the last to fall, his reflection reaching out and pulling him into the mirror's cold embrace. The farmhouse fell silent once more. Epilogue. Months later, a team of urban explorers stumbled upon the abandoned house. They found no signs of Marcus's team, only their equipment scattered across Leah's bedroom floor. The mirror stood untouched, its surface pristine. One of the explorers, a young woman named Sophie, approached the mirror, drawn to it despite the warnings from her companions. Her reflection stared back at her, unblinking, as if waiting. Suddenly the whispers began. "Sophie, Sophie." Her reflection smiled, and then it reached out. The farmhouse still stands, a beacon for the curious and the foolish. The legend endures, growing darker with every soul it claims. And deep within the mirror, the trapped faces watch, waiting for their next victim. Because some places are not meant to be understood, some doors should never be opened, and some shadows never let go.